for staying with us. You are watching KTN Sunrise Live. Now, just yesterday we were talking about small and micro enterprises in the country. We're talking about entrepreneurs, and we're talking about some of the opportunities that are available to them. There is a conference that's taking place at the moment. It's being organized by the African Union and other stakeholders. It's called the CAMI Conference, which is a conference of African Ministers of Industry. And it's looking forward towards making Africa that powerhouse that it needs to be. Now, just recently, Aliko Dangote, who's Africa's richest man, has been talking about some of the 3 areas that we really need to invest in as a continent. That's infrastructure, agriculture, and manufacturing. And according to him, he says, if we invest in these 3, then this is the way to go in terms of taking the continent from the dark ages into a powerhouse that is recognized by other continents. And I suppose this and many other issues are what are being discussed at the CAMI conference. And indeed, what it means for you and me as a Kenyan, as an African, indeed, when all of this comes together, and how important industrialization is for the growth of our economy. And to help me discuss this and to tell us why this is important, why you need to know about this, we have Ms. Treasure Maphanga, who's the Director of Trade and Industry, Africa Union Commission. We thank you so much for joining us and for your time.
Thank you for inviting me.
All right, and welcome to the country. First time, or are you here regularly?
No, not regularly, but I have been here a number of times, so it's good to be back in the context of this important conference.
Absolutely. Yeah. This is a great time for the continent, isn't it? The African Union just commemorated 50 years, and I suppose we're looking to the next 50 years. Tell us about, where Africa is now as it stands in terms of trade, in terms of growth of the economy, in terms of trade, within the continent and of course outside, and just our relations with other parts of the world.
Well, indeed, this is a very important moment for Africa. I think the messages that are coming out of the 50th anniversary summit are that Africa is now standing proud and looking forward. And what have we achieved? I think over the last decade, everybody has been remarking about the consistent level of, growth in our domestic product. And we're talking about GDP rates of about 5.5% on average across the continent. The story that is not told is that this is an average, and in other words, it means that some economies are struggling and others are growing at a level of double digit. But also what's important about the story of our economic growth is that unfortunately the levels of poverty are not reducing significantly. So we are having basically jobless growth, and there are some serious questions about how we are going to be able to sustain ourselves. One of the important aspects of Africa's economic renaissance is about the issue of taking charge of our own destiny and reducing our dependence on aid and so on. And this is why it's very important then to recognize that as we sit and look at where, our engagement in global trade, for example, Africa is still sitting at 3%. And what are we exporting? Petroleum products, raw materials, minerals, not anything much that will really be have components of value addition. So this is really one key challenge that still faces us. The other is we've been looking carefully at the African Union level with our partners and stakeholders on the continent about the dynamics of intra-African trade. And in fact, we had a summit and a theme of the conference, the whole of 2012, focusing on intra-African trade, its potential, its challenges. And I think studies that were done in 2011 by UNECA showed us that the level of intra-African trade is as low as about 10 to 11%, which is extremely low when you look at other regions like Asia, like Europe, where we're talking about, intra-regional trade of about 50, 60, 70%.
Wow.
So what we are basically recognizing as Africans is that what has happened to us, we keep on talking about markets, but we have our own markets. And also, everybody else in the rest of the world is coming to the continent, forging partnerships, negotiating deals, because they recognize what we have that is very special, and that is the arable land on the continent, and that is the mineral resources, the human resources, in terms of our age profile, the abundance of educated young Africans who can actually be productive and engage. However, this is something that we as member states on the continent have not capitalized on. So this is what brings us then now to this discussion about industrialization and the context of development. Because for us, we are looking at trade and industrial development as tools for development of the continent. And what we are basically recognizing is that when we are exporting raw materials, we are exporting jobs. And yet we have invested as governments so much on education, health, and all the other aspects that were covered in the Millennium Development Goals. And indeed, I think our governments should be commended for the efforts that they have made together with civil society, private sector, and other actors to advance. But we're still seeing major challenges when it comes to infant and maternal mortality.
Yes.
So there are some aspects of the MDGs, obviously, which need to continue. But what the discourse that is happening now in the area of economic development is that we should ensure that when it comes to education, we don't just accept targets for basic primary education. We should be talking about education in terms of technical and vocational skills, because it's not so much the knowledge base that's a problem, it's the skills base to actually make a difference.
Indeed.
And then finally, the other issues, of course, have to do with putting in place in a new framework that's being discussed right now and will be a subject of the meeting in New York in September, a post-2015 development agenda. And that is actually the main theme of the conference that has brought us here to Nairobi, which is how we can accelerate industrialization of Africa and within this new framework and this new mindset.
Okay. And even as we talk about, the conference and what's being discussed there, we have the MDGs, which were set by all African countries and saying we will have certain targets by 2015. It included education, it included universal access to healthcare services. Industrialization wasn't mentioned. Is that a good thing? Do you think perhaps that this is something we should have put in place, and is that why now we're talking about development post-2015 at the conference?
Well, industrialization wasn't included. I mean, there was a goal number 8 which talked about partnerships, global partnerships, and that mentioned trade. And that, I think, is what the major oversight might have been. I think in the wisdom of course, looking at all, you have to prioritize at the end of the day. So I think that it's not to say that we should. In my view, we should always try to see how we can address the critical factors that will enhance and contribute to development. But it's true that the economic side, the aspects that deal with growth and that will spur industrialization, are absent, and that is actually what we are promoting heavily to be included in this new framework. Because even as far as trade is concerned, we have spent a lot of time and energy on the continent in negotiating various trade agreements, looking for market access and so on. But at the end of the day, the question is, what are we trading and what are we producing that we can actually, trade competitively? And so it is with this realization, and I think what it is that it's a process of learning, from this experience and saying, well, within the MDGs, they were focused on social goals, not so much on economic goals.
Right.
Now what the continent is saying in its common position is let's rebalance and let's focus on the economic aspects as well, because that is what will give us sustainable development.
Indeed, and will indeed also help in terms of meeting those goals, the social goals.
Indeed,
because once you have that, and then you can be able to do that. Let's talk about the challenges that face industrialization in the country, and that face a lot of African economies are facing in terms of just putting industrialization into play, and manufacturing and some of those things, and even the things that push investors away when they want to come and invest in this area.
Well, I think that when it comes to the challenges around industrialization, I think first of all, within the national development plans and the planning process, what we are seeing is that industrialization has been overlooked. It's less visible. So even the domestic resources that we invest in this area are limited. Hence, that is already a constraint in terms of our capacities to forge very sound industrial policies that will ensure that, in fact, those policy frameworks can be implemented so that we can create jobs and so on. And the further, what we are seeing is that most of our countries, if we're looking across the continent, the businesses or the private sector that we're talking about are basically small, micro, and a few medium-sized enterprises. And what I think is interesting for us is this whole discourse that we are having now, where we are saying, yes, SMEs are key and they need to be supported. But if you look at what most of them are doing, they're working in the services sectors. It's very difficult for small, micro, medium industries to emerge on the continent. They face special constraints and barriers because of the fact that they need access. It's the factors of production that come into play.
That's right.
So either if it's agriculture, it's agro-based, they will probably need land, they will need water, they will need electricity, they will need an infrastructure that in terms of also rules and regulations that are conducive and enabling. And then also they struggle specifically to get finance. I think all SMEs face this factor, but SMIs even more, because oftentimes there's a longer lead time in terms of actually making profit and being able to sustain. So they need different financing structures for industrial development. And so what we are basically seeing is that as far as doing business is concerned and wooing foreign direct investment, many of our governments are putting a great emphasis on that. What we see is that they have forgotten that those investors could be coming from elsewhere on the continent.
Yes.
They could also be and should be coming from within the country. The importance of building your economic base on the people who are there already, and let those people then promote the advantages of doing business to other business people who are coming in. So it's about clear regulations, reducing red tape, transparency, and so on. I think all of that, we see that as Africa we're making great strides in terms of the doing business studies on the continent. The best performers, or those that are making the best improvements, in fact I've been coming from East Africa. Last year it was Rwanda, this year it's Burundi. So I think that it's very important that as we apply these policies and review reform to make sure that we can produce a conducive environment, we don't lose sight of the fact that we need to grow our own industries.
That's right. And I think, the world is probably waiting to see what investment Africans are making in Africa before the rest of them can have the confidence and say, well, it looks like it's worth doing. But I think, like you say, as long as we don't invest in it and the environment is not conducive for us to invest, then also the foreign donors are thinking, is this really what we want to do if they don't have confidence in their own industries and in their own capacities? Let's talk about agriculture and industrialization. And like we said, Africa's greatest resource is the arable land. It's flat and it's very good for farming. In fact, I believe the latest statistics are that 65% of the world's arable land is in Africa.
Yes,
how can we utilize this great resource to take us towards full industrialization?
Well, at the African Union, we have a framework which is basically a comprehensive agricultural development program, and it's called CADAP, and it has been in place for the last 10 years, looking mainly at the agricultural production side. I think what is the moment now is to look much more carefully at the agro-processing and how we add value to the agricultural products so that we can sell them domestically as well as across the continent and elsewhere in the world. What we are seeing is that the paradox is that we still have problems of hunger on the continent, when in fact we have actually the elements that should make this possible. So what is missing? I think that some of it has to do with building institutional capacities, and some of it also has to do with our education education systems, looking at developing the kind of skills that we require that will actually focus on this particular industry. And what is important is that what we're seeing as well is that in terms of approaches to developing agriculture, we're looking at specific value chains, such as cotton, such as, rice, such as leather. We're looking at that carefully, and what we are seeing is that often when, from the production side may be improved, but then there are all the sorts of post-harvest losses that take place. So all the energy that has been put place, and then we also have some challenges when it comes to, the actual processing capacities. As I mentioned earlier, issues of energy and so on. So that is also very, very challenging to accomplish. But even beyond that, we've been discussing in the last 2 days even issues like packaging. When you look at this packaging, it's very important as part of the value addition to agricultural products. And we still have an underdeveloped infrastructure across the continent in terms of this important area, which of course means that where there's a challenge there's an opportunity, right? So for entrepreneurs, they should be looking at this and saying, well, what can we do about it? But I think at the end of the day, we also are finding that when it comes to tariffs, and within Africa, it's actually most African countries have set higher tariffs for agricultural products versus other products. So, so they are not actually enabling, products to move easily across the continent. And then also quality, standards and norms differ from country to country.
That's right.
So that also has an implication. So I think at the end of the day, we have been, exporting. I know from East Africa you have some products that you have been exporting even to Europe and other regions. So we know that we have the potential to satisfy even the most sophisticated and most complex markets. The issue is scale. How can we scale up, and how can we make sure that at the end of the day we have more efficient markets in terms of agriculture?
And indeed, even just before we began the interview, we're talking about trade, which we're very big on in terms of having all these trade agreements between individual countries and Europe, individual countries and the United States and all of these developed markets. But there's also a great opportunity for intra-African trade. And I believe, our president has also been very keen on fostering greater ties, amongst countries within the continent. Could this be one of the areas to spur industrialization, where we say, okay, it's great that we have all of these trade agreements with international, organizations with other countries internationally, but that perhaps there's a huge gap that's left within the continent?
Indeed. The African Union has always, in fact, was established with the whole vision of integrating the continent, because the continent's prosperity is also linked to the extent to which we can integrate. And we are looking at the development of the tripartite free trade area as one of the key building blocks towards a continental free trade area, which will basically create economies of scale, greater opportunities. So for industrialization, this will definitely be an enabler. We have targets, for example, that have been set between 2012 to 2022, the next decade, to double the level of intra-African trade. And that will be possible when we integrate, and also that will be possible when we start to address some of these non-tariff barriers. The practical things that business people face at borders when they try to move across and when they try to trade amongst themselves. But what is also interesting, which I must share, is that when we looked at, even though the volume of intra-African trade is low, there are two things that are striking. First of all, it is low because our statistics don't capture all the intra-African trade. There's a lot of informal trade, and so this is where the small and micro industries or enterprises are basically they are actors, and we don't capture them in our statistics. So this is one area that needs priority.
There's a lot that's happening.
Yes,
we just haven't recognized it, captured it, and we're not telling that story.
We're not telling that story. And in fact, a lot of those agents of trade are women. And so there's a gender dimension to that invisibility of the contribution of small businesses. The second part of it is that what we found was that 46% of the current levels of intra-African trade are actually light manufactured products. So in spite of the fact that we have this challenge amongst, when we trade with the rest of the world, we're trading just raw materials. But when we trade amongst each other, we're trading some, it's shoes, it's, light equipment. It is really the aspects of manufacturing which we believe are a sign that something is happening in Africa. And something is happening in Africa. So this conference that we are having is actually, I think, being propelled by the fact that although we face constraints in terms of resourcing industrialization, we face constraints in terms of an enabling policy environment, but they are efforts that are being made, and this is what we need to harness.
Okay, and indeed, just capturing that data and those statistics, that's very important in terms of doing that. Now, let's talk about, the aim of the meeting. We have all the African ministers of industry, including our own Aden Mohammed, who's present at the meeting. What are the expected outcomes of this? What can an entrepreneur who's watching us today saying, look, I have started my small business, I'm making my peanut butters, or, it's some form of manufacturing, probably not, at the biggest scale. And also for those who are, medium industries, and for the big ones as well, the big manufacturers, what do they hope? What should be their hope of the outcome of this meeting?
Well, I think first of all, I want to, commend the government of Kenya and the people of Kenya for welcoming this important conference here at this time. What the ministers, we have had 2 days of deliberations at the experts level on this theme of the post-2015 development agenda. So I think one of the key outcomes that we expect will be a clear statement in terms of coming from the ministers of industry on the continent regarding the positioning of industrialization in the development discourse going forward. Why is this important? It's important because if you look at the MDGs, when we place priorities on the MDGs and we had indicators, it also created, in a sense, a compact with the developed world in terms of areas that would be financed from official development assistance. So it is also, so we are saying this is very important. But also what we are challenging ourselves to look at is what can we do to mobilize domestic resources for industrialization. So one of the key themes that has been hampering us is this long-term financing of industrialization on the continent. So we are talking, we have the African Development Bank, we have other, financial players, international organizations, as well as the governments themselves and the private sector engaged in this discussion about long-term financing. The other sub-theme that is very important is that of capacity building and looking at how we actually develop the kind of skills that will take industrialization forward. And so we are looking there in terms of the institutional framework, the progress that has been made, but also what we need to do to move forward together at the continental level. And I think that the final thing is that there is an important issue that is globally there, that following the Rio Plus 20 conference, the world is also looking at how do we make sure that we have some approaches which are basically fostering more of a green economy and looking at how we can do less harm to the economy as we produce and manufacture. And I think on this point, what I want to underscore is that we are promoting these industries that will save energy, will save, the resource base. But what we also are resisting is a prescription, that is imposed, because we also believe that we have to be pragmatic. That's and in the, we don't want to put so many hurdles on the way of the person who's saying, I have a business idea, I want to do this. So it is about keeping in line with the regulatory environment that is already in place. And it is also about looking at, I think out of this conference, some, key opportunity areas are being discussed. I mentioned the area of packaging, that's coming out clearly. I'm also looking at the fact that we have different institutions that have been working across the continent on different quality standards and norms. So what we are now discussing is a Pan-African quality infrastructure, which will be a great step forward if somebody in Kenya is saying, how do I grow beyond these borders? I'd like to look at other markets, because now it's so expensive to do business across the continent because we have these different standards. And so this is another issue that I think will be quite important coming out. And then I think finally we are advocating strongly for the gender dimension, for the women who feel that, I would like to do this, but my society doesn't quite encourage that women should participate in, in big industries.
Yes.
It's about changing mindsets. That word has been used a lot.
Yes.
That we need to promote and engage and include young people, especially in this industrial development. And so policies have to be set to basically create an environment that promotes this, as well as, of course, the women.
Okay. Well, we see some action points that now all the ministers going to their respective countries will now be presenting to their presidents and to the cabinet, and say at the CAMI conference we have talked about some of these action points, some of these deliverables, and integrating that into their policy frameworks.
Well, yes, indeed. What we have already, in fact, I wanted to highlight that there is, in 2008, at the level of heads of state and government on the continent, we adopted a continental framework for accelerating Africa's industrialization. We call it IDA for short. And this framework is it's comprehensive. It has basically a number of clusters, so it provides a broad framework that guides our member states as they forge their own industrial policies. What this conference is about is spurring us into action. Okay. Because what we are saying is that, we have these grand ambitions. We would like to use, industrialization as a tool for diversifying our economies. We want to use industrialization for job creation. We want to address all the challenges that we face. However, what we are seeing is that the pace of moving forward is rather slow. Yeah. So it is about an acceleration, putting on the, and really motivating that to happen, and to come up with some more, strategies, that are perhaps country specific or region specific, that will move this agenda forward.
All right. Okay. So good news for entrepreneurs as they, look at this conference that's coming up. What will they hope for? Not just in Kenya, in Namibia, in Botswana, in South Africa, in the DRC, in Algeria. What good will come out of this for the ordinary SMI?
Yeah. Well, I think we have talked so much about public-private partnerships, but they have tended to be, very broad, and in some respects it becomes very vague.
That's right.
And I think that we are now at a moment where within the CAMI process there is really a good understanding that coming out of such meetings we should be identifying specific areas where the public and private sectors can work together to advance and go forward. So whether it's in terms of financing, whether it's in terms of energy issues, we have had some very specific presentations made about examples of what has happened in Kenya, for example, or within the East African region, which we believe will be important for us to share in other regions so that we can learn from each other. Similarly, the experiences that are coming from the West, about how they are progressing on their processes, which is very important. But more than anything else, for the ordinary citizens, I think that as they're looking at the political process and looking at priorities that are important, it's very important that we should look at a political system that's going to deliver this economic empowerment for the continent. And I think that within that context, what we are doing is harnessing the skill and actually, this political will. Because somebody has said to me before, I think you have all these frameworks. They're all on paper. Yeah. has the continent really decided to industrialize?
Exactly.
This is my own hope and prayer, that at this meeting there should be no doubt by all the citizens on the continent that, you know, there's something different about the level of commitment that's coming out of CAMI 20 in Nairobi. That in fact we are now moving beyond just all the talk. We're talking about some concrete actions, and we are basically a declaration will emerge from this meeting, which we have a responsibility to take back to the policy making organs. So it will at some point be placed before the assembly of the heads of state and government.
Okay.
So this is where it's going. So it's a very important platform for advocacy, for harnessing that political will, for reshaping partnerships so that they actually deliver concrete results. And finally, I think for the people that are, you know, wondering, well, what is this, how is this going to change anything? I think we're looking at strategies that will really also align the policy framework to and really promote industrialization from all sides. So this is what I can say.
Okay, all right. Thank you for all of this, and indeed for saying that, and this is the message, that Africa is ready for industrialization, and we're ready to move forward, and this is the acceleration and push that we need. We thank you very much. We welcome you again and again, not just for the CAMI 20, but you know, Kenya is a good place for investment. So allow me as a Kenyan to push for investment.
Thank you very much.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. We have been speaking with Treasure Maphanga, who's the Director of Trade and Industry at the African Union Commission. We're talking about CAMI 20. It is the Conference of African Ministers of Industry that's taking place in Nairobi, has been put together by the African Union. And this is very important to note that Africa is ready, serious and committed to pushing for industrialization, which will spur our economic growth and indeed enable us to have social development and to achieve MDGs and beyond. So for the ordinary entrepreneur, we've been talking about entrepreneurship quite a bit this week, so this is in line with that. We can be sure that the policies, the frameworks, and a lot of stuff that will come out of this one is that is accelerated, that it is made easier for you, that an enabling environment is created for you to be able to do your business and to thrive, not just here in Kenya, but let's look, you know, at our neighbors. Let's look within Africa first, and then we can move internationally. I think if we grow together as a unit, we can be the formidable force that we want to be in the world. That's what's happening. We thank you for your time. We thank Ms. Treasure Maphanga as well, and we will be looking for the outcome of the CAMI 20 in the coming weeks and months in our respective countries. That's all for now. We want to take a short break. We'll be back with lots more.